I'm pressing the button. I hope there isn't a delay and that we are live. Oh, we're live. It says we're live. Let's proceed as
All
if
right.
we're live.
All right, welcome. Hello, Sorika. How are you getting on?
Not too bad. How are you?
I'm all right, enjoying the fine weather, this Indian summer that we're having. It's a gorgeous day down in Cork. Not in Cork, it's beautiful. So, welcome to the post-show chat of episode 47. This is episode 48 of the Candid Tales podcast, where we're going to be talking about the conception of Mongan. Sorika did a great job of telling that story. So, if you haven't heard that story
right there, because apparently our playback is not working, and I don't know what to do about that. They are not receiving enough video to maintain a smooth streaming. I don't actually know if we're streaming or not. Ah dear, teething problems. So yeah, live, but nothing.
Let me check.
I'm just texting Oisin to say we're live, but nothing is happening. So we might have to restart.
Yeah, we'll restart.
I don't know if this is something to do with my Wi-Fi. I have full bars. It shouldn't be. But everything on my computer has now decided to stall, which is fine.
Smooth streaming. No, we're live, right?
Okay.
I don't actually know if we're streaming or not.
Okay, well, can you mute it now?
Yeah, I wanted to check that. All right.
Okay, cool. Well, I can't see you, so I'm just going to rely on the live chat to tell us if you guys can see and hear us, because the feedback that I'm getting from YouTube is that we're not live and nothing is happening. So sorry for interrupting you there, Aaron. Please go on. You were talking about the story.
All right, so we have a few teething problems. Apologies. Last week, my audio was a bit glitchy. Apologies, I've moved into a better room for Wi-Fi connectivity. And we're figuring this out. We're really enjoying the comments and posts, and people are getting in touch with us with these stories. So that's really good and encouraging. Thank you all for getting in touch. We are talking about the conception of Mongan, which is last week's episode. Thank you, Sorika, for telling us that story. It was amazing. Should we recap that story really briefly? Like, in a Games of Thronesian type of way? Last week on...
I guess. I mean, people, you could, if you haven't listened to it, because I think it came out on what, Friday?
In fairness.
So it came out on Friday. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, it is a story.
I'll do it. Super quick. Two kings sharing kingship in Ulster. Mental. What were they doing? One king goes to Norway and he meets his friend, good pals. He was really sick. Had to go get a cow off a Cailleach dove, and then he promised to give her back loads more cows, probably, maybe, if the king of Norway was sound. I don't know if he was or not. Anyway, he stands guard over the promise. He goes back to Ireland. Turns out the king of Norway was not going to be okay with it. He didn't pay her back. He didn't honour his word. And the Cailleach dove was out of cows, no more cows. He got better because of the Cailleach dove's cow, and he didn't pay her anything. Nasty old king of Norway. And the Cailleach dove came to Fiacre, one of them?
Fiacre Finn.
In Ulster, asking him for retribution. They go to war to, pay back for the belief in the honour and the duty and the word that he should have paid the guy back dove. And then they get attacked by killer sheep, eat the entire army until Manannán MacLear shows up and says, I'll sort it out if you give me a chance to ride your wife. He releases a load of hounds from his cloak. They eat the sheep, and he goes off and changes into Fiacre Finn, and in front of the wife they copulate, and she gives birth to a hairy baby called Mongan.
Interesting use of the word copulate there. I don't know why that struck me, but that just really struck me. Clinical.
Our producer and musician and genius galore, he tried to summarize this in a similar Aussie man style review, which kind of inspired that brief synopsis
I
of that story.
see.
It's
I
much better
see.
than episode 47. But there we go. So we're caught up. All right, we're on the same page.
Yes,
Yeah,
on the same page. That's fine.
that story's mental.
It
There's a
is.
few talking points. One of the main talking points is at the start. Let's go back to the very start. Ficre Finn and Ficre Dove. Why are they sharing kingship? What's this shared kingship about? Is this like a weird thing to do with the land not being whole? Does it have any other kind of metaphors that we can reach at, or is that too much that I'm reaching for here?
Yeah, it's a kind of an interesting status quo to come in on because it does like there's a duality there. I always think it's interesting in myth and in fairy tale where you get these characters that almost seem to be mirrors of each other. You know, you get like the ugly stepsisters in Cinderella, and really they're kind of the one person, but they're fragmented, they're split in some way. And I think in this case there might be something like that going on because they're both Ficra. There's Ficra Finn and Ficra Dove, which just means fair-haired Ficra and black-haired Ficra. Um,
Yin, yang.
who knows really? Because really the only things that we know about them are in this story, what happens. Or at least I haven't found any other stories about like why the kingship is set up in this way. There's no real explanation given. That's just kind of like this is how it is. I think it's kind of it's an interesting little look at. I think the whole King series will talk about this more, and I think we've talked about this in the past a little bit. Like the kingship in Ireland was different than kingship in the rest of Europe. Kind of kingship in medieval Ireland was a slightly different thing, in that you didn't have this idea of primogeniture that like the eldest son would inherit from the father. You had a much more fluid kind of thing, where members of a certain strata of society could be elected king, and it wasn't democratic in that it wasn't open to everybody. It was certainly a very kind of status conscious society. um One of the things I like about this whole idea of the ranks, all of which we've lost, by the way, in modern times, and maybe that's good for some of it. You had 7 degrees of kingship, and you had 7 degrees of lordship, and some of the lords might outrank some of the kings because they didn't quite. It wasn't like the lowest king was higher than the highest lord. It didn't work like that. You had this whole really complicated system of clans and tuas and tributes and who was loyal to whom and all of this kind of stuff. So I think the kind of messiness of Irish kingship is hinted at here a little bit. And yeah, you have for a period of time 2 kings in Ulster, which proves to be unstable because it doesn't stay that way.
I
Spoilers.
mean, it's kind of funny. You're like, that could never happen with a governing body sharing leadership for a small part of the time. That would never happen. That's
I
ridiculous.
know, it's like having a rotating Taoiseach or something. Like what a weird idea.
But does that symbolize kind of a fractured state? Is Ulster in a kind of a limbo of not really having a full leader at the time, not having it's never a divine leader as a lot of the kings in Europe are claimed to be kind of chosen from God. We never get that thing. It's never
Yeah,
handed
we
down.
do and we don't. Like it's kind of because the king is kind of it's not the same kind of divine right to rule, but there is a kind of an idea of the king being the paragon. Like you have to be physically perfect. There's this idea of mating with the land, and there's this whole idea of like kings being perfect, exemplars of justice and having good judgment being really really important for a king. So they are kind of there is a kind of an idea of a divine mandate. It's just we didn't think that got passed down genetically necessarily. There was a kind of a thing here where it was like, all right, this person might be a good king, and maybe his descendants will be good kings, and we'll keep an eye on the line. But also, his cousin might be a great successor because it's not a given that his kid is going to be great at this. So
Sure.
there's a little bit more, and also like it's not a given that the eldest son is going to be great at it, which is like you have that comes up again in Nile of the Nine Hostages, which you're going to be telling in a couple of weeks, which is another really nice one of like how the king gets to be the king, and we've a few of them
And that's why
coming
we're doing the King
coming up.
series at the moment. It's really interesting looking at kingship, and like this one is fascinating at the get go because if we're looking at like even if we like delve into that idea of Faker Finn and Faker Dove, the white and the black, or the fair and the dark, that aspect of like the dark half of Finn or the dark Finn is king
You
in
mean the
Ulster,
dark
while
Fiacre?
sorry, Fagra, is and the lighter figure is off traveling and going, oh, I'll visit my friend, I'll do something, exuberant and lovely, and it'll just be a lot of fun, la 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 la. Where it's not grounded, he's kind of up in the head and that sphere,
He's up in
and
the
he's not
air.
maybe like the repercussions of his actions, and all his story really plays out a big repercussion for a very flighty action. I'll go off and I'll
I
get this in.
and like I think that's a huge theme in the Mongan stories, and we're telling them as two separate ones because I like them too much to cut them. Is the kind of the idea of the bargain without knowing of and of the long term consequence of like a short term snap decision, but I think there's also something really interesting there about like Fiacre Fiacre Finn acting in his capacity as like a private person, and then subsequently the consequence comes back to him when he is acting as the head of Ulster. And like it's not really a state in the sense of a modern nation state, so I don't know if that's kind of the right framework to look at it, but he's certainly like it's more of a tribal leader position. So when he goes out and when he meets the King of Norway, he's just acting for himself. He's just Fiacre Finn on his travels, and he's kind of out of his context. And then when the repercussions come back on him, and the Cailleach Dove turns up at his doorstep saying, "You were my guarantor, and the bargain has been broken," so he's suddenly the leader of his tribe. So it's not just him anymore. It's everybody in Ulster is affected by his actions. And I think that's a really kind of, like I said, it's kind of a recurring one in this story. So you like look out for it in the next podcast as well. This idea
Yeah,
of
I think it's
making a
fascinating
deal.
the fact that okay, so first of all, I think it's a great idea. A year on, year off. Like the burden of kingship is all of a sudden halved, and your man gets to go off on holiday for a year. Delighted, like fantastic.
There,
It doesn't get
my immediate reaction to that was like, "Of course you think it's a good idea, Aaron."
no one's giving out to him for having drinks in Phoenix Park. I mean, I'm going off to Norway, and
No, no one cares that he went to live in a van for a month. No, it's
no,
fine.
don't point your
No,
finger at me.
no one minds that he went off to South America for a month that turned into 3 months. Nobody minds at all.
Okay, it's the yin and the yang. You're supposed to work hard.
Jesus,
When
no
you
wonder,
working.
no wonder Fiacre Finn fucking kills him.
I'm down with this whole figure dove thing. I like it. I think it is possibly the fact that he's a twin. And I always said I could do with a twin, and I go off, have fun. He stays around here and does the work. That'd be great.
I feel like if you had a twin, he would think the same way that you do, and neither of you would do anything.
I think we'd be a pretty good tag team. I say as my invisible fantasy brother that isn't actually real.
Your invisible fantasy brother is worse than you.
We're getting way too. Let's get back to the story. So I do this. We get to the honor of being the guardian, being the protector of the Catholic doves. I guess promise and making sure that she will get paid. But before we get to that, all right, there's a couple of issues with calling her the Black Hag. Can you I mean, just as hearing it, and a couple of times, like, my modern sensitivity going, and you call, and the Black Hag, geez, what? And Black Lives Matter came up, and we all got very, very careful about the language we're using, and now all of a sudden we're calling this Black Hag. the one who starts a war.
What?
So
Why do you
can you?
think hag or black is a bad thing to call someone, Aaron?
This is not about me, sir. You informing us. Tell us what the definition of black in this, the connotations that it has in this
Well,
context.
remember as well the way that Irish is structured. So, like fiacre fin, the word black or the word light or the word fair is usually applied to hair, not skin. So, fiacre dove means black haired fiacre. It directly translates to black fiacre and fair fiacre, but it's referring to their hair colour. In the case of a Cailleach is a hag, and the Cailleach is kind of a figure in Irish mythology, and she's often a very powerful figure. But it can also, Cailleach can also kind of mean a little old lady. And in the case of a Cailleach dove, it is an old woman who dresses all in black. It is an old woman who it's basically a widow woman, and particularly a widow woman who has no family. So she's a kind of a, it's a particular signifier of her status and her position in society, and it being like not a particularly good position in society. Like she's not in complete poverty and destitution, but she nearly is. Like she's on a very, very thin knife edge in her survival, because she's, this is a, again, you're kind of looking back in medieval Ireland, this is a very clan-based society. And so if you don't have a family, you don't have a clan, and you're on your own, that's a different position in society that you occupy. And that's kind of why she's so wary of giving up her cow, because that would make her very vulnerable. She doesn't have, and then you also kind of like consider the way that law was enforced. The kind of tribal law that we have in Ireland that was subsequently kind of codified into Brehon law. It was up to your family to demand redress, and it was dependent on your family. What fine you would get was dependent on your status and your family's status. So the fact that she's got a cow, that's what she lives on. She lives on the milk of the cow and what she can trade. And here comes a guy saying, "Gives your cow." Her position is very vulnerable then. So she has to kind of go, okay, if you guarantee that this will not come, that I will get what I'm promised.
Sure, but that's I think that's taking a very human view of the woman in this story, which is like, the obvious thing to do, because quite literally she has one cow, that's all she survives on, and we'll talk about the cow in a minute and how that represents kind of fertility and abundance, and it comes up again and again and again. But there's also another, the reason, the fact that she's called a Cailleach dove is there's more to her presence here. Like it's the far dove. It's like the black man in Irish stories as well. It's like he's not like the devil himself. He's gonna stir up some mischief here. The Cailleach dove in this story.
Yeah, Cailleach dove, as I understand it, does have a literal meaning, which is a widow woman, like a woman with no family, an old woman with no family. But you're right that there is an additional connotation to calling, like, to having the far dove and the Cailleach dove, and particularly like Cailleach on its own, it means a different thing. So there are kind of other connotations to this, and like the idea of her being some sort of otherworldly trickster is not without merit, I think, particularly because of the type of cow that she owns, because white cows with red ears are very strongly associated with the other world. Red cows in general, the number of places in Ireland that are called Red Cow. Like there's obviously a big roundabout outside Dublin, there's the Red Cow roundabout, but there are so many places and little towns and little inns that are called the Red Cow, because red cows tend to give a little bit more milk, and were just extremely highly prized, and considered to be very lucky and very good. And they're also, I think, considered to be kind of sweet tempered. So they have a sort of a place in both our history and our folklore that's just really special. And I think that the kind of pinnacle of the red cow is actually the white cow with the red ears. And they're almost magical. Like Bridget is supposed to have been suckled by a white cow with red ears. And they're just kind of this like paragon of cowness. They're the best cow. They're the best kind of cow.
Yeah, the greatest cow of all time, Keane's cow. What was his name again?
Keane's cow, the Glasgowan.
Glasgowan, yeah, again, white cow, red ears.
Yeah.
Don't know why red ears make you have more milk, but there you go. But it's like there's a magic element, and you already realise, like, if in this story she was called an old widow woman and she had a kind of magic cow, you kind of go, oh, the poor widow woman. As soon as she's named the Cailleach Dove, you're like,
your spidey senses go, ooh, Cailleach.
Yeah, and so it's kind of interesting that she doesn't accept the first bargain. Yeah. She says, no, I'm not going to take a cow for a cow. Yeah, okay, I'll take a cow for every 4. Only though, and again, does she see that this is not going to be honoured? Does she know that the King of Norway, like, is it a way of going, I've got something here now, and you have to your word?
Like, it's very kind of characteristic of figures from the other world that, like, if you break a bargain, if you break a deal, if you go back on your word, that the consequences are enormous. So she's kind of like, she drives a hard bargain, certainly. And again, from a human perspective, if you read her as just an old widow woman, she's just being canny, and she's just like looking out for herself. But if you do read her as somebody otherworldly, it's like, okay, if the bargain were honoured, there would be no problem. But the fact that the bargain isn't honoured, she then, and does she know? I don't know. Does she know that Fiachra Finn is a part-time king? Does she know that when she goes to have this enforced, she will be instigating a war? It's not explained. It's open to interpretation as to how much of this is kind of like otherworldly manipulation and how much of it is like you should just keep your promises even to people that you don't think are important. Because I also think like that to me is an interesting part of this, is like, if you read her as purely human, then she's the lowest of the low. She's the lowest position in society. She's a woman alone who has nothing and nobody to stand up for her. And therefore, if you're a powerful person, you might think, it doesn't matter if I don't treat her well. And the consequences for the King of Norway for deciding to not treat her well and deciding to not honour his bargain are devastating. So that's, I think, also that's also an interesting little bit of it.
Well, it brings back to the fact that, the highest of the high, no matter, like, if your word is your bond, you have to do what you set out and you said you would do, even if it's just for the lowest of the low. And she's presenting herself as the lowest of the low in a way that seems to be like, the King of Norway might screw me over, but you have to be the guarantor. Yeah. And how she gets to Ireland to ask him when he's actually in kingship is beyond me. If she has literally no other means.
I mean, she cries on a dock until someone gives her a lift. Being completely pathetic is a kind of currency. It's not a good one. It's not a comfortable one, but it is one. She gets herself there through grit.
Yeah. So again, she survives somehow because the King of Norway, he's sick. He needs a magical broth made from a cow with red ear, a white cow with red ears. Mm-hmm. And he gets better, and instantly, even though Fiachra Finn specifically says, now remember your promise, do not break that before he leaves. He makes sure he's oath bound to accept it and leaves. And then the King of Norway rejects it. Is that, again, the story is just a nice little opener of how mistrustful people in a country can be of their leaders, how we don't take their word on many things, and how oftentimes a person in power can say one thing and never ever follow through with it. Mm-hmm. And that kind of seems to be what Fiachra does. And it's like, he's not on like King of Norway. What the fuck you act like?
There is somebody in the chat saying that he might have been the ancestor of a certain political leader in Europe at the moment, soon to be not in Europe. But that's a little spicy and political, so we'll leave it.
Look, we like to just show mirrors with mythology.
Listen, if you see some real world reflections of this, you are probably right. Yeah, like I think she gets herself there. And I do think that the idea of like oath breaking, and you can definitely see resonances to that in kind of modern politics. The idea of once a powerful person has gotten what they want, there's very little to actually force them to follow the rules because they can get away with not doing it. And that's kind of, we don't get the King of Norway's perspective in this, so we don't know why. Did he forget? Did he decide, fuck her, I'm not paying her? Or did Fiachra Finn just make this deal when he actually had no mandate to make this deal? And the King of Norway was like, well, I didn't promise you 4 cows. The King of Ulster promised you 4 cows. Go get them from him. We don't see the decision making behind the scenes there. So it's kind of, but yeah, she makes her way to Ulster.
Before you want, I mean, like, we very rarely have a moralistic link with Irish myths. It's very rare, and it's just it flags as one of like, oh, this is one you could probably hinge a hook on a moral kind of, as a listener, you
do. Just the morals are real weird sometimes.
This one's a straightforward one. Like,
this one is a one that we still agree with.
Yeah.
A lot of them are lessons that we as a culture are like, not anymore. Not such a good look these days. There's plenty of like, if somebody gives you their back long enough, stick a knife in it, kind of morals in Irish mythology, but like we just don't think that those are great anymore.
This one is a good moral. This one is like, if you say you're going to do something,
if you like that sort of thing,
if you like that sort of thing, I like it.
I would say actually quite a lot of the King stories particular hinge on this idea of keeping promises.
Yeah.
Like we saw that we've already got a podcast out, I think, on Cormac McGart, who's one of the other great kind of semi-historical kings. And again, he makes a promise without he makes a promise without knowing the cost, the bargain without knowing. And the whole story of Cormac McGart and the Land of Promise hinges on the fact that like once he's given his word, he cannot as king break it. So he has to follow through on this dreadful bargain that he's made. Yeah. And this is kind of another one of those, there's a deal made. So there's a lot that are like about keeping your word. And I think a lot that kind of indirectly are like, be careful what you promise. Because once you've given your promise, you have to keep it. And again, more on that in the next podcast, because the next story, you will see more white cows with red ears and more bargains without knowing and lots more stuff.
There's still some stuff to unpack in this one. Don't get ahead of yourself.
Plenty to unpack next week.
Plenty to unpack next week. But before we get there, what's the story with the killer sheep?
I think that is one of my favourite bits in Irish mythology. It's so left field, like. It's so left field. Nobody saw that coming.
Nobody saw that coming.
And I love the reaction of the Ulster warriors. Is not like, oh my god, there's killer sheep. Is like, this is embarrassing. I can't die of sheep.
Oh, my dinner is eating me.
This is so embarrassing that I'm not fighting it. Like Fiachra Finn, there's a source that I found for this that I'll post on Patreon actually, because it's a nice version of the story. There's a whole like sequence in it where Fiachra Finn goes out killing, warriors of Norway, and then he sees the sheep and he's like, this just feels wrong. Just feels so wrong. And all the Ulster men are like, can't, like, there's no glory to be had here. We can't, like.
There's really not. Like, I was staring. I had a big long look. I had a little bit chat with a sheep yesterday. I was and I was looking at two sheep, and the weirdest thing happened. Right, I was looking at these two sheep, and I said to my buddy, he was like, "God, there's not a lot going on in there, is there? Their eyes are tiny, and they point kind of other ways. And as I was telling him a little bit about this, like imagine if they had razor sharp teeth and like some way of killing you. Like, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be overly scared of them still. Like, you know, they're pretty small. They're really bony legs and kind of a little bit of a neck. And then as I said that, right, he turned around to his other sheep, and the two of them, as if to say hello, just went poof, and butted, like head butted each other. And then they just stood next to each other, like kind of like half sniff each other. I was like, that did that just happen? What? So sheep are weird.
Sheep are weird.
And killer sheep.
Like regular sheep are already pretty weird.
Weird. Very weird. They're just bizarre looking.
They're just weird little things.
So like killer
They're very
sheep.
cute from a distance. They're very cute from a distance. The closer you get to them, the less appealing they become, I find.
They really aren't that appealing when you get close.
They look like adorable cuddly clouds when they're real far away.
Far away, but they have like this weird look at them.
Yeah, they've got those weird like wall eyes, and they've got like the straggly matted. Well, I don't know. Listen, I'm not going to start talking too much about sheep.
That's all I'm saying. If you get too close to them, so like if something's like trying to bite at you and you're supposed to kill it, you're like, get off me! This is awful. And for warriors of the Ulster cycle, and we've heard so much stories of how they want glory and death, and they want their names written in the stars.
They don't want their names written in the stars. They didn't have writing.
I mean, you know, say it in the stars.
No.
Revealed in the stars?
A quote from Disney's Hercules. You keep quoting Walt Disney's Hercules. I don't like it.
I saw it when I was a kid, alright?
I know. It clearly imprinted somewhere deep in your psyche, because I've been trying to get you to stop saying it for years now.
Right? We all look at the stars. It must be a thing that they were thinking of.
No, it was a good line by the writers of Walt Disney's Hercules.
All right. Tell me about fucking Manon on you. Fuck you.
I'll stop taking the piss out of you when you stop saying it. Yeah. So Manon. Manon's an interesting fella. Because he's one of the figures that is not actually Tuatha Dé Danann. Although he's often associated with the Tuatha Dé Danann, and he often kind of comes up in similar cycles to them, but he apparently predates the Tuatha Dé Danann. He was around before them, and he's one of the few characters in Irish mythology that turns up in kind of all of the cycles. Because he turns up in the Ulster cycle. His wife and Cuchulainn have an affair, and he turns up to shake his cloak between them, and he is, in some tellings, the one who allows the Tuatha Dé Danann like to come into the other world and kind of creates the other world, because he has a magic cloak, and if he shakes it between two people, they will never meet again. So there's one version of the Battle of Talchu is that Manannán shakes his cloak between the Sons of Mill and the Tuatha Dé Danann so that they can never meet again. And that's kind of what essentially partitions the world, which is cool, right? So he's this interesting kind of figure, but he particularly crops up in the Cormac McGarth story, and he kind of particularly crops up around kings and kingship. There's another story that we once wrote a play about before we started doing Candlelit Tales, which is the Voyage of Bran, where Bran and his men are sailing out on a voyage of discovery, and they meet Manannán riding in his chariot across the waves. And he's actually on his way to go and meet with the Queen of Ulster in that story.
God, yeah.
That's what he says to Bran. He's like, I am on my way to go and conceive a king in Ireland.
Brother a king, yeah.
There's a link.
That's hilarious.
And that is the same Bran MacPhail, by the way, who's in the Battle of Ventry, who is the father of Con Crither, and who gets the Tuatha Dé Danann to come and help. So the little interlinks. There's little cool little interlinks with Manannán MacLear. So yeah.
Manannán, like, you know, the fact that even the Tuatha Dé Danann kind of showed up for the Fianna in that cycle, in that story, the Battle of Ventry, there's no chance Manannán is on the side of the guys in that battle. who are fighting with both Darragh, and many of them are named, but there's no sign of Manannán in there.
He's not named because he's not technically one of them. And again, at the end of that story, he's given the crown of the King of the World to hold. So like he's an interesting kind of liminal figure. He's not quite part of anything, but he's also one of the most involved of the kind of gods. I don't like calling them the gods, but we don't have a better word. But he's one of the more kind of involved, otherworldly figures in the affairs of Ireland, and particularly in the affairs of kings. He shows up having to do with kings more than he shows up having to do with anything else. And it's often in a kind of a trickster mentor kind of a way. Like, if you think of the Cormac McGart story, he tricks him into making a bargain, he kidnaps his family.
In order to teach him great lessons and wisdom of the other world. And he seems to do the same. His whole deal here is like, let me father a king, so therefore I can go and bring him into the other world and teach him. Is he just like sick of looking at everyone fucking around and making a mess of things and going, all right, you know what? Let me just teach one of you, and maybe you guys will get it.
Who knows? I mean, this is the interesting thing about a character like Manannán. He's not like, there's nobody's ever kind of sat down and gotten his like motivations out of him. I mean, maybe this is a big experiment for him. Maybe this is something that he likes doing. Maybe this is entertainment. We don't know what his agenda is, except that he has an interest in kings. He has an interest in kingship. He has an interest in like wisdom and magic and teaching people how to do stuff. But he's also quite hands off. Like he doesn't often tell people what to do. The closest he comes is actually in next week's story, when he turns up to kind of prompt a character in a direction.
So, but he's also the king of the sea.
How do you spoil a 3,000-year-old story? Would you feck off?
Okay, well, before we get on to next week, I just want to say, like, he has a great interest in kings, and he does crop up in this king cycle. We're really enjoying delving into these king stories again and again and again. And one of the names of Manannán MacLear is the king of the sea, the god of the ocean. So it's kind of interesting that he has that authority to come in and interplay and have some form of leadership that's, I don't know. I've been swimming a lot this summer, and I'm like, yeah, makes sense. Just get into the sea all the time, and you're just grand. So, like, everything is just grand if you go for a swim. So that's the moral of the story. No, anyway. Look, happy birthday to Jasper. We wanted to shout out to Jasper.
Oh, Jasper's in the chat. Hello, Jasper.
Hey, Jasper, come here. Happy birthday. Thanks for following us and supporting us so well. You've been great. I want to give a big shout out to Patrick, who reached out to us today as well with a beautiful message. He's been a supporter on the Patreon page for a while. Thank you, Patrick. But also, he said he was on Hare Island trying out a few of our stories and trying to tell a few of the stories. And he says he needs a bit of work. Keep it up, Patrick. I believe in you. I think you do a great job. Because that's the whole point of these stories, is listen to them, shy talk away with someone else, and try and just get these stories back into circulation. Because some of these stories were written down and they became back into the circulation to some degree. And it's interesting to hear stories of folk tales that were written down, same way made up even, and fake fiction that became then the tradition of storytellers as well. So telling stories is part of us anyway. So it's just a great thing to be doing.
And it's always nice to see what other kind of angles on things other people come up with. Because I think when you tell the stories, you start to see your own kind of little bits of things. Things that you'd highlight or things that you're interested in that maybe the story, the telling that you heard first doesn't delve into as much. So that's also kind of part of why it's nice to get them circulating again, is that you get more versions of them coming back to your own ears.
Absolutely. And we've one more question from Kieran, who asked, we've mentioned archetypes in mythologies, and he asked a very interesting question: is that are are all of these stories, do they all have archetypes? He doesn't quite fully understand what an archetype is in terms of are they reflective of what's in us, or is it more what's kind of in a theory of psychology? So instead, I'd feel that to you.
Thanks. Well, I mean, the idea of an archetype is something that comes from, Jungian psychology, and it is kind of somewhat supported by some studies in mythology and comparative mythology, because what tends to happen is that you tend to get similar characters and similar plot lines coming up all over different human societies. So the idea behind the kind of theory of archetypes is that these are not stories that we passed around. These are stories that kind of grew up organically in different cultures, and therefore, why are they so alike? And that's why the idea of an archetype is that this is something in our kind of collective subconscious, that this is something innately human in us that we give expression to in stories in slightly different forms. So that's kind of my understanding of what the term archetype is. I'm sure other people have better definitions, but like that's kind of it is kind of a theory, but it's I think it's a theory that in my experience holds a good bit of water, because if you start looking at mythologies around the world, you will be like, oh, that guy's very like the Dagda, and that's a very Lou type of character, or oh look, they have a trickster guide, how Mananon. You kind of start to see similar tropes and characters coming up over and over and over again. And yeah, that's kind of.
Although he's a trickster, like he's also he seems to be a big teacher as well.
Yeah, he's a guide trickster. He's a mentor trickster. But he's kind of his teaching methodology is very trick based.
You know what? Someone, Richard Marsh, once wrote a review of one of our shows saying, I think these guys are doing a great job because they're tricking people into learning, which I thought was like, yeah, sound.
That's how you learn. That's why we start all our live shows with jokes and then end them with making everybody cry.
Or just, with music and then get people to feel good, whatever.
Yeah, okay, exactly. Look, get them to feel good so you can punch them in the heart.
Yeah, you're so psychotic sometimes. Anyway, look, we're going to be putting out a call to action next week. I've been in touch with a few different podcasts which will be coming up. We'll be chatting with Unreal. We'll be chatting with Shy Talk History Podcast as well. They're two different podcasts that delve into similar stuff. Unreal does folk tales, and Ruth is her name. I can't remember her second name, but she's doing folk tales and mythology. We're going to be linking up with them in the next coming months and talking about kings and folk tales with them. And look, we're looking for, as Patrick asked us, for a bit of, he asked us, do we have a podcast promo that he could send on to Reddit pages, because he wants to introduce us to all of the people he wants to talk to. That's really cool, Patrick. Thank you. We would love your suggestions if you listen to podcasts that we don't know about, that you think we would get on with. And we would love if you dropped us messages about them and drop them a message about us. That's a good way of us to interact. So we're going to put a call to
Who would you like to see us collaborate with?
That's what.
Yeah. Who would you like to see us collaborate with? Tell us and also tell them. Especially if they're bigger than us, because they'll, they won't know who we are. But also, if they're not, who do you think would be interesting, or who would you be interested in seeing us collaborate with? That would be great to hear from you guys, and to get the ball rolling on some more collaborations, because we're looking forward to the ones that we have already drummed up. Yeah.
So next week we'll hear about the kingship of Mongan. Stay tuned. It'll be great. It's a mental story.
Also, yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about Dovlaka next week, because she's like, by a mile and a half, the best character in this entire sequence of stories.
The best character.
So look out for more bargains without knowing, more white cows with red ears. The
best character.
The best character. And also, King Mongan. He's also there, I guess.
Jesus.
Oh yeah, more Kalyuks. More Kalyuks.
There are more Cailleachs.
There are more Cailleachs, not just in the Mongan story, but also in like all of the King stories. They're a thing.
The Cailleach in the Niall story. She's only
so there's a Cailleach in Conor O'More. There's so many Cailleachs in the King stories. They are like, they seem to be an integral part. It's great.
All right, guys. Thank you very much for tuning in, for listening, and we'll see you next time. Hope you keep it healthy, safe, and sound. Slán go fóill.
Bye.
Just keep smiling.
Yes.